Hello everyone, this is Jeff with Mississippi and the Civil War. Welcome to episode 5 of Mississippi and the Civil War, and in this episode I'm going to cover the end of the war, and it was going to be a very bloody and painful end for the state of Mississippi. In the spring of 1865, you saw the surrender of all the major Confederate armies in the field. You had the Army of Northern Virginia surrendering on April 9th, 1865 at Appomattox, Virginia, followed by the surrender of the Army of Tennessee on April 26th, 1865 at Bennett Place near Greensboro, North Carolina. And the last major Confederate army east of the Mississippi River to surrender was that of the army commanded by Lieutenant General Richard Taylor, who surrendered the Department of Alabama, Mississippi, and East Louisiana, effectively ending the war east of the Mississippi River. And shown up here is the proclamation from Mississippi Governor Charles Clark announcing the end of the war. This is from the Daily Clarion, May 7th, 1865. The Army had surrendered the day before. And scenes like this were very common with the end of the war. Civil War historian James M. McPherson wrote a very apt description of conditions facing the South in 1865. He said of the region, "It presented a bleak landscape of destruction and desolation, burned out plantations, fields growing up in weeds, railroads without tracks, bridges, or rolling stock marked the trail of the conquering Union armies. The collapse of the Confederate authority left large areas without law and order. Roaming bands of free people and white refugees suffered from disease, exposure, and hunger." And I think this is a very accurate description of conditions in the immediate post-war South. Conditions in Mississippi were as bad, if not worse, than anywhere else in the South. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today, what it was like in the immediate days and months after the surrender of the Confederacy. And to begin the process of restoring order in the South, the Union Army left 200,000 occupation troops in the region to help provide stability in the wake of the collapse of the Confederate government. Military courts punished criminals. The Freedmen's Bureau courts regulated regulations between former slaves and their former owners. Army hospitals treated thousands of Southern civilians, both black and white. The Freedmen's Bureau issued 150,000 daily rations, one-third of which went to white refugees, and the Army fed at least as many more Southern civilians. The Freedmen's Bureau continued to provide food relief even after the immediate post-war crisis ended. Between 1865 and 1870, the Freedmen's Bureau issued nearly 22 million rations to Southerners. So in a very real sense, it kept starvation out of many a Southern household in the years after the war. During the first months after the Confederate surrender, many Southerners went through what can only be described as a period of shock, despair, and apathy. One of the earliest journalists to tour the post-war South was Whitelaw Reid. He toured the Southern states in 1865 and 1866, and he wrote of white Southerners that he encountered. He said, quote, "They expected nothing, were prepared for the worst. They would have been thankful for anything. They asked no terms, they made no conditions. They were defeated and helpless. They submitted." And this is from his book, After the War, A Southern Tour. And if you've never read it, I highly recommend it because it gives a very good description of what life was like in the defeated former Confederate states. And it is available on Google Books. You can download it for free, so it's out there and easily available. And as you might expect, a number of Mississippians felt a huge amount of anger toward the federal government. As historian James M. McPherson explained it, Southerners were a proud people who had staked all and lost all. Hatred of their conquerors was a natural response. And a good example of this was Captain William H. Dudley of the 21st Mississippi Infantry. A former Confederate officer, he had poured out his frustrations in a letter to his former commander, General Benjamin G. Humphreys. And he said in his letter, "For my own part, my heart was in it. I repent no effort I ever made to tear this miserable government down. My whole heart is imbued with hatred for the government that crushes us, and though I see no hope but in quiet submission, still my love is not won." And this kind of sentiment would have been fairly common amongst Southerners, and particularly former soldiers. They may have submitted, but they were still undefeated in spirit. Now, the losses that Mississippi suffered in terms of soldiers was just devastating to the state. John L. Power, who had been superintendent of Army records for the state of Mississippi, made a study after the war and concluded that 30% of the Mississippians who fought for the Confederacy had died in the conflict. Approximately 78,000 men served the state, and of that number, 12,000 were killed or died of wounds, while 15,500 died of disease. This loss was about 1/4 of the white males aged 15 and above that had been counted in the 1860 U.S. Census. So the casualties were just immense. Basically, you had almost a generation of white males either killed or wounded, and the state was going to be very hard pressed to get over these kinds of losses very quickly. Now, many of the soldiers who did return home in 1865 were permanently disabled and unable to support their families, either in the short term or the long term. In 1865, John L. Power estimated there were about 300 amputees in the state that needed artificial limbs, and advised Mississippi Governor Benjamin G. Humphreys that $30,000 was needed to pay for these artificial limbs. The state legislature set aside $60,000 to both pay for artificial limbs for veterans and to help aid widows and pay for the education of children of Civil War soldiers that had either died or become disabled. Governor Humphreys felt that this amount was still not enough and recommended that 20% of the entire state revenue be appropriated for the purposes of caring for veterans and their families. In 1866, the number of dependent orphans in the state of Mississippi was estimated to be 10,000. One institution that was created to help take care of these children was the Confederate Orphans Home of Mississippi, established by the Mississippi Baptist Convention in 1865 at Lauderdale Springs, just outside of Meridian. Opening in the late summer of 1866, by Christmas, the institution had about 50 children under their care, and in less than 2 years was home to over 200 orphans. The home took in children between the ages of 6 and 16, and not only orphans, but they also took in the children of destitute families that simply couldn't care for their children. The home was open from 1866 until 1878, when the last of their charges was successfully placed with friends or family. And I've shown in this these advertisements here. These are a couple of fundraising efforts by the orphanage, and they were constantly having to do this, appealing to the public for funds to help keep them going, which they successfully did. Of the physical damage done to the state of Mississippi, the most striking was that done to the cities and towns of the state. As historian William C. Harris stated it, quote, "Where armies had trod or cavalry units had raided, commercial centers and hamlets lay in partial or complete ruin." And towns astride railroads were natural targets for some of the worst damage, as they were quickly targeted by the invading Union Army. And because of their tactical and strategic value, they were subject to extreme pillage and destruction. Chaplain Elijah E. Edwards of the 7th Minnesota Infantry kept a diary and sketchbook during his service, and he described the following scene in Oxford, Mississippi. He said, Quote, I saw everywhere scenes of riot and the wildest confusion. Many houses were in flames and others were being plundered relentlessly by the mob, consisting of mostly soldiers without guidance but acting as any unruly mob would do. They carried from the buildings all kinds of plunder, most of which could not be of any use to them. They carried mirrors, rocking chairs, vases, articles of wearing apparel, bedding, books. As the smoke grew denser, the scene grew more weird and more like Hades. This piece of diabolical tomfoolery was capped by an exhibition that would scarcely be deemed possible in a civil war. A drunken man on horseback came galloping through the smoke, holding before him a grinning skeleton which he had stolen from a doctor's office. It is said that this vandal was a surgeon's assistant. Whoever he was, and I did not want to know more, his act was the most revolting that I have to chronicle. And scenes like the one described here were common throughout the towns and cities of Mississippi where the Union Army had traveled. Probably one of the cities to receive the worst damage at the hands of the Union Army was the city of Jackson, Mississippi. In 1860, Jackson, Mississippi's capital, had a population of 3,000 and was a growing, prosperous place. In 1865, the town was simply devastated. On June 18, 1865, the New York Times reported that the town was, quote, once a beautiful city, it is now a mass of ruins. Piles of brick and mortar cover the once famous retreats of wealth and fashion. Numerous columns, shattered and charred, have suggested for the name of the place Chimneyville. The State House, the Governor's Mansion, the City Hall, and the Asylum are the only public buildings remaining. And Jackson was not alone in receiving this kind of treatment. A number of towns in the path of William T. Sherman's march from Vicksburg to Meridian in 1864 had been almost totally destroyed, except for private residences, and even they were not always spared. At Enterprise, Mississippi, all of the stores and houses were burned. At Lake Station, a Union officer reported, quote, the Signal Corps went through the town like a dose of the salts, and as he left, he noticed a man attempting to get someone to make an affidavit that a town had existed before the raid. And Meridian, which was pretty much just a small hamlet before the Civil War, before it became a junction of the Mobile and Ohio and Southern railroads, during the war, the town was completely wrecked by General Sherman's men. Except for 2 hotels, the Union Army burned almost the entire business district. Another town that saw the hard hand of war was Corinth. It had been fought over during the war because of its location at the junction of the Mobile and Ohio and the Memphis and Charleston railroads. One visitor after the war described the town, quote, as a bruised and battered village surrounded by forts, earthworks, and graves. In May of 1866, a traveler to Corinth wrote the following description for the Weekly Democrat of Natchez. He said, quote, the sight I saw of vast numbers of Confederate bones, whose skeletons and parts of skeletons lying exposed and bleaching in the field, in the bushes and in the hillsides, under the logs and the stumps, and the forest trees rent in all directions, and torn by shot and shell. All of these sights are well worthy of a brief record. In the Delta, Friars Point and Prentice were almost completely destroyed. Yazoo City, Grenada, Greensboro, and many other towns in central Mississippi were partially burned. Crystal Springs, Summit, and Magnolia, towns along the New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad, all had burned districts from Yankee raiders. And there were a few towns in the state that did escape the war largely intact. Vicksburg suffered damage in the 1862 naval bombardment of the city and again during the 1863 siege. But because the town was occupied by the Union Army from 1863 to 1865, the city really escaped much of the destruction that had been visited on other cities in the state. Natchez was occupied by the Federals in 1863, and thus the town again largely escaped destruction. Columbus was never attacked by the Federals and survived pretty much by and large intact. But even towns like Vicksburg, Natchez, and Columbus that escaped destruction during the war suffered from the property decay by owners that had fled in the wake of the Federal invasion. And this was particularly true in Natchez, where many owners abandoned their property and prior to the Union occupation and fled to Confederate lines for safety. The economic losses to the state of Mississippi during the war were just huge. The freeing of 400,000 slaves cost the people, the white Southerners, an immense amount of money. In 1860, Mississippians had a personal wealth of $351,636,175. Of that amount, $218 million was in slaves. In 1870, the personal wealth of Mississippians had been reduced to $59 million. And with the slaves freed, planters could no longer use them as collateral on loans. And when other forms of security, such as land, declined in value, they could only get loans by paying very high rates of interest. So it made commerce in the post-war Mississippi very difficult. 60% of the livestock in the state of Mississippi was destroyed in the war, either killed or captured by the Union Army. In 1860, the value of livestock in the state was $41,891,692. By 1870, the value of Mississippi livestock was only $23,530,710. It's just the losses that the state had to absorb were just simply incredible. And many landowners who returned to their property in 1865 found that the federal government had leased their land to Northerners or to former slaves. In the Vicksburg area alone, the Freedmen's Bureau estimated that 136 abandoned plantations were being leased, 113 by Northern whites and 23 by former slaves. Although these plantations were eventually returned to their owners, it was only after the 1865 planting season was over. And the Delta probably contained some of the most fertile lands in the entire state, and it suffered more damage really than any other region in the state. Although there was not that much fighting going on in the Delta, flooding from the Mississippi River devastated the region. Levee maintenance had been neglected during the war, leading to many breaks in the system, and also the Federal Army had cut some levees to flood valuable cotton-growing land. In 1865, Union General Andrew A. Humphreys estimated that, quote, the greater portion of the improved lands in the Delta Basin were flooded. The condition of the railroads in Mississippi in 1865 was terrible. In addition to the physical damage suffered by all the lines in the state, the companies that owned these railroads had huge debts and long overdue bond interest payments. With little working capital left, paying off these debts was going to be very difficult for them. The New Orleans, Jackson, and Great Northern Railroad had over 90% of its rolling stock and locomotives destroyed during the war. The Mississippi Central Railroad reported that Confederate forces had destroyed $366,000 of its property during the war, and the Federals had destroyed another $344,500 of their property. In 1865, the line was $1,589,000 in arrears on a debt of $3,358,000, and the other railroads in the state were in equally poor condition. And even those railroads that were still in working order were in terrible condition. Whitelaw Reid traveled on one of the railroads in Mississippi immediately after the war, and he later said of the journey, "Of the trip between Jackson, Mississippi and Grand Junction, Tennessee, I only remember a dismal night of thumpings over broken rails and lurches and contortions of the cars, as if we really were trying in our motion to imitate the course of the rails the Yankee raiders had twisted." Riding up the post-war rails in Mississippi was a very uncomfortable proposition. And when the war ended, financial assets in the form of currency, insurance policies, and Confederate bonds were all suddenly worthless. Banks were closed, and the hard currency that had circulated in the state prior to the war had been largely removed during the conflict or seized by the Federals. So there was just very little for the people that were left in the state to make a go with in the immediate post-war era. And many Confederate soldiers returned home in 1865 only to find the assets of a lifetime of hard work literally wiped out by the war. Private Henry A. Moorhead of the 11th Mississippi Infantry summed up the situation that many returning soldiers found themselves in when he wrote, "After much worry and trouble, I reached home and loved ones on May 14, 1865, but not so gay and sprightly as when I went away. Just what to do I did not know. It was too late to make a crop, and not a dollar except Confed, not a bushel of corn, nor a pound of meat, nothing but a wife and child. So you can see I was in the middle of a bad fix." And many Confederate soldiers made it home too late to help out with the spring planting, but some did find that their families, anticipating their return, had planted a small crop just to see them through the winter. Most soldiers were home by late June, unless they were in a northern prison camp, in which case the trip home might have taken a little bit longer. And a lot of the veterans that did return in 1865 were in such poor condition physically that they were really unable to do much in the way of hard labor when they got home. A traveler who attended a meeting of 300 people in Aberdeen in 1865 estimated that 1/3 of the men in the crowd had either lost an arm or a leg, while 1/2 of the rest looked debilitated from the hard campaigning of the war. The Natchez Courier called on the citizens of that town to employ the numerous disabled veterans to, quote, paint signs in houses, do plastering or whitewashing, carpentry or bricklaying, basically any work they could physically perform. And conditions for families in Mississippi in 1865 were dire for a lot of families. Many families were living basically hand to mouth in 1865, and the New Orleans Times reported that in the state, quote, extreme poverty rules in almost every household. And Northern journalist John T. Trowbridge visited one family in northern Mississippi after the war, and he found them living in a crude log cabin amidst the ruins of their former home. And he said of the two white women that lived there, quote, one of these was young, the other aged and bent with grief and years. The walls and roof were full of chinks, the wind blew through the room, and she crouched shivering over the hearth. And this probably would have been a very common sight in numerous households in the state in 1865. And if life was difficult for white families in 1865, it was even worse for many of the newly freed slaves. Many of them had moved off of the plantations where their owners had kept them to larger cities such as Vicksburg, Natchez, and Columbus. And in many cases, these former slaves lived in extreme poverty with little support other than that of federal rations given to them by the United States government. Severa Wright, a northern teacher who came to Vicksburg to help educate freedmen, wrote of the conditions in one camp she visited at DeSoto Point, just across the Mississippi River from Vicksburg. And this is from a description from May of 1865. And she said, "It could not but arouse our deepest sympathies to go over the river on a cold morning, such as we have had for the last 2 weeks, and see the fires built upon the ground, with women and children gathered around trying to get some warmth and baking a little hoe cake, the material for which had been given them by some kind fellow servant, or parching a handful of corn, which was all the food they had or expected to have through the day. Some of the destitute have been provided with clothing, but there is still need for more. One woman has 6 children under 10 years of age. She lived in the open air 3 weeks. through storm and cold. Her children are all barefooted and, with one exception, bareheaded. They have nothing but what they wear, not even a blanket for her little babe. I am glad to say she has now obtained a shelter and a bed, but the prospect of obtaining food for her family is very dark." And freedmen who remained on the plantations were generally tended to fare better than those that flocked to the cities. Needing labor and having some concern for their former slaves, most planters did furnish enough food and supplies for them to survive the winter of 1865, although it was a bare bones existence at best. And all levels of society suffered in Mississippi, but none lost more in terms of property value than the large planters of the state. With few exceptions, this class was almost totally bankrupt in 1865. A good example is Thomas A. Locke of Charleston, Mississippi. Before the war, he was a planter owning $18,000 worth of property. In 1865, he told President Andrew Johnson that he had, quote, "only a small tract of land and 4 mules, the latter purchased with the remnant of corn left by the federal forces. I am very badly in debt, and my creditors are pressing me." And this would have been common for landowners throughout the state. And in the immediate post-war era, many of them would go on to lose their land because they couldn't pay their debts. And merchants in Mississippi had an equally hard time after the war. Many owed large debts to mercantile firms in New Orleans and in New York, and the only way they could pay their debts and obtain new credit was to try and collect what was owed them by their customers. But unfortunately, their customers generally were as broke as they were and had nothing to pay. And unfortunately, almost everyone was destitute, and the merchants were able to recover very little of what was owed them. Edwin L. Sabine, a piano dealer in Vicksburg, was owed $56,000 by his customers in 1861. After the war, he was able to collect only $1,200 of the money that had been owed to him. And a Natchez newspaper editor said of the condition of the merchants in Mississippi, quote, "with no means to recommence life now, with credit destroyed and defrauded of their only means for settling their old debts, they must stand aside and let northern men and northern capital come in and do the business of the country." And with the collapse of the Confederate government in 1865, most of the county governments in Mississippi ceased to function as well, and many of the parts of the state had a complete breakdown of law and order. Many people had no other means of survival, turned to stealing, and in almost all the interior counties of the state, marauders stole cotton, mules, horses, basically anything of value. On June 18, 1865, the New York Times reported that in central Mississippi, quote, "the Confederate authority is not recognized, the federal has not yet been established, and thus the country is suffering all the grief of an interregnum, or more properly, of anarchy." And while conditions were pretty bleak in Mississippi in 1865, things could have been worse. If the state had been an industrialized society instead of an agricultural one, the task of rebuilding would have been a lot more difficult. With hard work, with adequate money or credit for farm provisions, and a government to provide some stability, an agricultural society could rebuild. And that was what Mississippi was going to do, very slowly to be sure, but it was going to rebuild over the decades to come. But in many ways, Mississippi is still suffering from the losses that it suffered during the Civil War. Well, I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you have any comments, please let me know. I'll be glad to answer them for you. If you please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you haven't. And thank you very much. I'll be back with another episode very soon. And thank you for viewing.